Hello all and welcome to the seventh session of Direct Tax 2 fourth sem BCom of Mangalore University. Now so far we have discussed about as to how to calculate taxable income from house property uh, as far as let out house property is concerned. Now we have to look at another very important concept that is associated with the let out house property, and that is treatment for arrears of rent and unrealized rent. So these are two related concepts as far as let out house property is concerned. So we need to understand how do you treat it. First of all, let's understand what do you mean by arrears of rent. Thereafter, what do you mean by unrealized rent? And then we will see what is the treatment that has to be given if in case we come across a term called arrears of rent received or unrealized rent recovered. How do you treat such an item? Now, what is this arrears of rent? It basically refers to the payments that are overdue and that are supposed to be made at the end of a given period after missing out on the required payments. Let's take example. Suppose the landlord has raised the rent retrospectively. Suppose the rent per month, say till the month of March, let's say was rupees 10,000 rupees. But then there was a point in the agreement that the tenant may have to pay higher rent if in case the landlord decides to raise the rent anytime, maybe at this point of time or retrospectively. Retrospectively means from the earlier months. And suppose the landlord has raised the rent, say to 12,000 rupees, say from the month of October onwards. But the tenant so far has been paying only 10,000 rupees. So October, November, December, January, February, March, 6 months extended rent, that is 6 into 2000, that is around 12,000 rupees, that will be treated as arrears of rent. Suppose the landlord raises the rent of the house property retrospectively from the earlier months, then the tenant is liable to pay the same for such period. If the amount due in the current period is paid in the next year, then such amount received in the next year will be treated as arrears of rent. So there is no default from the tenant as such. The landlord has raised the rent retrospectively, that is from the earlier months, which now the tenant is supposed to pay. And suppose if the tenant pays the arrears of rent or increase in that rent of this year along with the rent of the next year, then in the next year, whatever is received relating to the current year, that excess portion of the rent, that is called as arrears of rent. So how do you treat arrears of rent when it's given in the problem? We will have a look at that. Next, we are looking at unrealized rent received. Unrealized rent, as we are aware, the tenant has committed a default and the tenant has not paid the rent as and when it was due, maybe for a number of reasons. Now, suppose if the tenant wants to correct that situation, wants to pay for the rent maybe of a month or many months which was long due, and if he is making the payment say during this year, then that will be called as unrealized rent recovered. Now, as far as the deduction for unrealized rent is concerned, we have seen that from the annual rent receivable ARR, we can claim deduction for unrecovered rent or unrealized rent, we say, or provided those rule 4 conditions are satisfied. Tenancy is bona fide, the tenant is not in occupation of any of the other property of the SSE, the steps have been taken by the landlord to vacate that tenant from all other properties of that SSE, and also convincing the assessing officer that any proceeding against the defaulting tenant is a waste of time. So when those rule 4 conditions are fulfilled, then we claim unrealized rent as deduction from the annual rent receivable. Now, unrealized rent can be received from the tenant in the subsequent year. Suppose the tenant did not pay rent for the month of January, February, and March. So for the first 3 months, that is of a particular year, the last quarter, the last 3 months, we say rent is not recovered. Now, the same rent for the month of January, February, March may be recovered in the next financial year or the next previous year. So at that time, that rent of the earlier year, which is recovered, will be treated as what do you say, unrealized rent recovered, or unrecovered rent, which is now recovered in the current previous year. Now, what is the rule? Whether we are looking at arrears of rent received or unrealized rent received subsequently, that is in respect of a let out house property, if it is not charged to tax in the earlier previous year, is taxable in the year of receipt. Now, how do you accommodate that? I gave you example of around 12,000 rupees arrears of rent received, that is of last year received in the current year. So when you are taking that arrears of rent is separately treated, and from such an amount, 30% standard deduction is available for that SSC. So whatever amount is received, that amount is taxable in the year of receipt, that is after deducting 30% of such amount for repairs. Now, very important point, it need not be for repair, basically standard deduction of 30%, because the landlord did not receive interest, the rent in the earlier year, the amount available NAV was less. So 30% was calculated on that NAV. But if that arrears of rent or unrealized rent is recovered subsequently in this previous year, it will not be added to the house property because it is last year's income. Separately, it will be shown, and before you add back, 30% standard deduction will be available. And one more very important point that we have to note, when the SSC is receiving that arrears of rent or that unrealized rent is recovered, presently whether the SSC is the owner of the property or not, it does not matter. So this is a very, very interesting point, because I might have sold the property to someone else. I'm no longer the owner, but then I am receiving arrears of rent or unrealized rent of the earlier years in the current year. So whether I'm the owner of the property this year or not, that is irrelevant. Whatever is the income, that is arrears of rent or unrealized rent recovered of these earlier years, 30% deduction will be available, and that will be added to the house property income. So this is about the treatment of arrears of rent and unrealized rent recovered in the subsequent years. Thank you.